A Navy SEAL stepped into a blizzard in Duluth, and his canines suddenly froze, ears sharp, sensing something hidden beneath the old bridge. The wind screamed off Lake Superior, snow cutting like knives. Then Mason Grady saw it. A tiny girl curled inside a cardboard box, lips turning blue, a note pinned to her coat that read, "Not wanted, please don't look for me." His heart slammed harder than any battlefield. He ripped off his jacket, pulled her close, and ran through the storm with Axel at his side, knowing she had only minutes left. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you were watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, let's hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Duluth, Minnesota didn't get cold in winter. It hardened. The city clung to the edge of Lake Superior like an outpost, all steep streets and working docks, its harbor cranes and warehouses silhouetted against a sky the color of iron. That night, wind drove off the lake with a deliberate cruelty, carving through gaps in clothing and turning every exposed patch of skin into a warning. Snow didn't fall so much as travel, thin, fast, and sideways, caught in the cones of streetlights and flung down the waterfront in streaks. The boards of the public walkway near Canal Park were glazed with ice, and each step made a soft, brittle sound, the kind you notice when the world has gone quiet enough to hear your own breathing. Mason Grady walked anyway. He moved with the contained economy of a man trained to conserve effort. Not because he was in a hurry, but because wasted motion had once meant consequences. At 38, he was tall without looming, just over 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, lean through the waist, his build shaped by years of physical discipline rather than a gym. His dark hair was cut short, practical, with a few premature grays at the temples that showed when light caught them. A trimmed beard shadowed his jaw. It wasn't unkempt, just indifferent. A thin scar traced near his right cheekbone, pale against the wind-reddened skin, and his nose had healed slightly crooked, an old break that never quite settled. His eyes were a steady, unshowy blue, and they didn't drift. They worked. They checked corners, tracked movement, measured distance, habits that had outlived the job that taught them. The leash in his left hand hung loose, and not because he was careless, but because he trusted what was on the other end. Axel padded beside him, 4 years old, a Belgian Malinois built like a coiled spring, narrow head, athletic shoulders, long legs that seemed designed for endurance more than speed. His coat was fawn with a black mask that sharpened his expressions, and a small notch in one ear gave him a permanently alert look. Snow dusted his muzzle and whiskers. His eyes, amber brown, bright and precise, took in more than Mason's ever could, and his gait was quiet, confident, the kind that didn't slip even when the world was slick. Axel wore a working collar, worn smooth in places, and he carried himself like he still had a purpose every minute he was awake. Mason had brought him down to the harbor for the simplest reason. The cold made it easier to think. It stripped everything to the essentials. Out here, the wind didn't ask questions, and the lake didn't care what you had lost. Mason preferred that kind of honesty. It matched the way he lived now, controlled, minimal, avoiding anything that might invite the past to speak too loudly. They were nearing the older bridge that crossed part of the canal when Axel's pace changed. It was subtle, a fraction slower, shoulders tightening, head lifting into the wind. The leash stopped swinging. Mason felt the shift through the handle before he fully registered it. He stopped and watched the dog. Axel's ears pricked, tail held level, and he sniffed again, deeper this time. Then he turned his head toward the underside of the bridge where darkness pooled beneath concrete beams, sheltered from the worst of the wind. Mason followed his gaze. At first there was nothing but the low roar of air and the distant metallic clink of something loose in the harbor. Then, between gusts, he caught it, a sound too small to belong to the lake or the city, a faint, fragile whimper, like breath scraping through cracked lips. Axel gave a single bark, short, controlled, and pulled. Mason didn't hesitate. He shortened the leash and moved with the dog down the embankment. Snow had drifted into uneven piles near the bridge supports. Ice filmed the rocks and patches of dead grass, and his boots slid once before he found footing. Under the bridge, the noise of the wind dimmed, muffled by concrete. The air here was colder in a different way, still, damp and stale, carrying the sour scent of old trash and wet cardboard. Axel led him to a clutter of debris near a support column, broken pallets, in torn plastic, and a collapsed tarp weighed down by snow. Half buried beside it sat 2 cardboard boxes pressed together, softened by moisture and sagging under ice. Mason's breath fogged in front of him as he crouched. Another whimper, close now. He peeled back the tarp. The first thing he saw was a child's hand. Bare fingers, stiff and purple at the tips, curled weakly against the edge of the box. The sight hit Mason with an immediate physical jolt, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Training tried to label the moment, threat assessment, ambush pattern, worst-case scenarios, but the reality was plain. This was not a trap. This was a kid who was running out of time. "Hey," Mason said softly, voice low and steady. He kept it calm on purpose. Panic didn't warm anyone. "Hey, oh, look at me." Axel edged forward and lowered his head, nosing gently at the opening. He didn't growl or lunge. He made a worried sound in his throat and then went still, as if he understood the difference between danger and fragility. Mason pulled the box flaps apart. A girl lay curled inside, no older than 7. She was small enough that the cardboard swallowed most of her body. Her hair was light brown, tangled and stiff with frost at the ends. Her face was pale to the point of translucence, cheeks mottled with cold, and her lips were tinted blue. She wore a thin hoodie beneath a cheap winter coat that hung too loose on her narrow frame. The coat's zipper had broken, the front gaped open, exposing the inadequate layers underneath. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, each inhale a small effort. Pinned to the front of her coat with a rusted safety pin was a folded note, already damp at the edges. Mason's eyes went to it and stayed there longer than he wanted. Not wanted. "Please don't look for me." The words were simple. That was the worst part. No explanation, no apology that mattered, no name, just a decision written down like a receipt. Mason felt heat rise in him, sudden and sharp, cutting through the cold with a clarity that made his hands shake. It wasn't the loud kind of anger. It was the kind that arrives quiet and solid, the kind that turns into action before it turns into words. Axel nudged the girl's cheek once, careful. Her eyelids fluttered halfway open, revealing pale gray eyes that looked unfocused, exhausted. They landed on the dog, then on Mason's face. Her gaze didn't ask for help so much as brace for disappointment. Her mouth moved as if she meant to speak, but only a thin breath came out. Mason didn't wait. He shrugged off his own parka, ignoring the immediate bite of wind against his arms. Cold poured into him, but it was a distant thing compared to the small body in front of him. He wrapped the coat around her, folding it snug, tucking it beneath her shoulders the way you secure a blanket around someone who can't afford to lose any more warmth. He slipped one gloved hand behind her neck for support, and the other under her knees. When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing. That fact scared him more than the storm. Children weren't supposed to feel weightless. Her body trembled against his chest, and he felt the frantic, uneven beat of her heart through the layers. It's okay," he told her, not as reassurance but as instruction, something to hold on to. "You're coming with me. You're not staying here." Her fingers clutched weakly at the front of his sweater, then slipped. Mason tightened his grip and adjusted his hold. Axel pressed close at Mason's leg, matching his movement, head up, eyes scanning. The dog's presence was steady, protective without being frantic, as if he had already accepted the assignment. Mason climbed out from under the bridge. The wind hit them immediately, hard enough to sting his cheeks and steal breath. He turned his body to shield the girl, angling his shoulder into the gusts. Snow struck his face like grit. He didn't slow. Up the embankment, the waterfront lights blurred behind a curtain of white. The city looked distant, softened by storm, as if Duluth itself had decided to pretend it couldn't see what happened in its shadows. Mason's jaw clenched. He kept walking, one step after another, boots finding traction, breath controlled. Axel stayed tight to his side, leash still slack, the dog's pace perfectly measured. Mason looked down once, meeting Axel's eyes. The dog's gaze was clear and intent, as if to say, "Go." Mason didn't look back at the box. He didn't need to. The note had done its damage. It had also lit something in him that had been dormant too long. He carried the girl toward the hill and the quiet streets beyond, the storm clawing at his back, his arms tightening around her with every gust. "Not wanted," he murmured, almost to himself, tasting the words like something bitter, then firmer. "Not tonight." He kept moving. Yeah, because stopping was how you froze, out here, in Duluth, in life. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking to escape his own memories. He was walking to keep someone else alive. Mason Grady reached his street with snow packed into the seams of his boots and the wind still clawing at his back. The neighborhood sat quiet beneath heavy drifts, modest houses half buried up to their porches, windows glowing faintly behind curtains, as if everyone inside had agreed to keep their lives small until winter passed. Mason's place was no different. A simple rented home with weathered siding and a single porch light that cast a weak yellow circle onto the steps. It wasn't a home built for family. It was a shelter built for solitude. Axel stayed tight at his side as Mason climbed the steps, the child's weight barely more than a bundle in his arms, yet somehow heavier than anything Mason had carried in years. Her breathing remained shallow, a thin thread tugging between life and cold. Mason fumbled for his keys with stiff fingers, every second feeling too long, and when the door finally gave way, warmth rolled out like a physical thing. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar cleaner and stale coffee. Silence lived here, not peaceful, but habitual. Mason kicked the door shut with his heel and moved quickly toward the living room. A small firewood stove sat against the far wall, unused most nights because Mason never bothered with comfort. Tonight, he did. He laid the girl carefully on the couch, which still held the impression of years spent with only one occupant. Axel hovered close, ears forward, watching Mason's hands with the alert patience of a dog trained to recognize urgency. Mason stripped off his gloves and pressed 2 fingers gently to the child's neck. The pulse was there, fast, fragile, uneven. "Avo, stay with me," he murmured, voice rough. It wasn't a prayer. It was an order he wished the universe would respect. He moved with controlled speed, gathering blankets from the hall closet. One of them, thick wool, smelled faintly of storage and cold fabric. He wrapped it around her shoulders and tucked it beneath her chin. The girl flinched, eyes flickering open for a moment, pale gray and unfocused. Axel lowered his head, breathing softly near her face. The dog's warmth radiated like a living furnace. He did not touch her with his mouth, only hovered close, as if his presence alone might persuade her to keep breathing. Mason crouched beside the couch and studied her face. There were bruised shadows beneath her eyes, dirt smudged into the creases of her skin, and a hollowness that came from more than hunger. She had the look of a child who had learned too early that adults were temporary. The note was still pinned to her coat. Mason removed it with careful fingers, the rusted safety pins scraping faintly. "Not wanted. Please don't look for me." His jaw tightened. He folded the paper once, then again, as though reducing its size could reduce what it meant. He set it on the table like evidence of a crime. Mason reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the keypad before he dialed. He hadn't called anyone in Duluth for personal reasons since he moved here. His life was built around not needing people, but this wasn't about him. The call went through after 3 rings. A man's voice answered, low and measured. "Rhodes. Dr. Rhodes, this is Mason Grady." A pause. "The veteran with the Malinois." "Yes." Mason's tone stayed steady. "Oi, I need you here. Now, hypothermia, child." The pause sharpened. "Address?" Mason gave it. "I'll be there in 15, Dr. Calvin Rhodes said, and the line went dead. Mason exhaled slowly. Axel's gaze lifted toward him, as if waiting for the next instruction. Minutes stretched. Mason fed more wood into the stove until the fire caught, crackling and alive. Outside, the storm battered the windows with persistent fists of snow. Inside, the child's breathing remained thin but steady, her small chest rising and falling beneath layered blankets. When the knock finally came, it was firm, practical, no hesitation, no softness. Mason opened the door to a gust of cold and the figure of Dr. Calvin Rhodes standing on the porch. Rhodes was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered and compact. He's the kind of man who looked built from decades of hauling medical bags through blizzards. His hair was silver and cropped close to his scalp, and his beard was trimmed neatly, more for professionalism than vanity. Deep-set brown eyes looked out from behind wire-framed glasses, sharp with experience and fatigue. He carried an old leather doctor's bag in his left hand, its surface worn smooth by years of use. He stepped inside without ceremony, stomping snow from his boots. His gaze flicked once to Axel, assessing, then to Mason. "Where is she?" Mason led him into the living room. Rhodes knelt beside the couch immediately, hands efficient, pulling back the blankets just enough to examine skin color and breath. "She's been out there a while," Mason said. Rhodes didn't answer at first. He listened to the girl's lungs with a stethoscope, brows drawing together. "Her core temperature is coming up," he said finally. "But she's on the edge. She's dehydrated, underfed." The doctor's voice remained calm, but there was weight behind it. He had seen too many bodies fail quietly. Axel let out a low, concerned breath. Rhodes glanced at the dog. "Good restraint," he noted. "He's trained," Mason said. Rhodes's eyes flicked back to Mason's face. "So are you." That landed harder than Mason expected. He said nothing. Rhodes reached into his bag and produced a thermometer, then a small flashlight to check the girl's pupils. She stirred weakly, eyelids fluttering. "Hey there," Rhodes said, voice softening in a way it hadn't with Mason. "You're warm now. Stay with us." The girl's lips moved. A sound came out, barely audible. Mason leaned closer. "Can you tell us your name?" Her eyes opened again, gray as frozen water. She stared at him like she was deciding whether names were safe things to give away. Axel inched forward, careful. His muzzle hovered near her hand. The girl's fingers twitched, then rested lightly against the dog's fur, seeking warmth without fully trusting it. A whisper slipped out. "Junie." Rhodes paused. "Junie," Mason repeated, as if anchoring it. "That's your name?" The girl swallowed. "Junie Vale." The name sounded delicate, almost too fragile for the cold night she'd survived. Rhodes straightened slightly. "All right, Junie, you're going to need antibiotics soon. I hear fluid in her lungs. Pneumonia starting." Mason felt a dull pressure behind his ribs. "Can you treat it here?" "I can start her warm. I can stabilize." Rhodes's tone stayed honest. "But she needs a clinic within 24 hours. Mason nodded once. Rhodes's gaze sharpened. "And Mason, protocol is protocol. A child found abandoned doesn't stay invisible." Mason's shoulders stiffened. "I know." Silence hung for a moment, filled only by the crackle of fire. Rhodes continued, quieter. "I'm not your enemy, but someone will ask questions. Social services, county." Mason looked down at Junie. Her fingers still clung faintly to Axel's fur. "I'm not sending her back out there," Mason said. Rhodes studied him, measuring the man behind the words. He seemed to see past the scars and military posture to something raw. "I believe you," Rhodes said finally, "but believing won't stop paperwork." He scribbled instructions on a notepad, his handwriting tight and practiced. He placed it on the table beside the folded note. "Keep her warm, small sips of water, no heavy food yet, and Mason." He hesitated, then added, "Try not to fight everyone who shows up tomorrow. Some will come to help." Mason's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes tightened. "And if they don't?" Rhodes's mouth turned grim. "Then you'll need allies." He packed his bag and stood. Axel watched him, still and silent. At the door, Rhodes paused, turning back once. "You did the right thing tonight." Mason didn't answer immediately. He looked at Junie, at Axel beside her, at the folded note like a wound on the table. "I didn't do it for praise," Mason said quietly. Rhodes nodded. "That's why it matters." The doctor left, the door shutting behind him with a final click. Mason remained standing for a long moment, listening to the storm outside. Junie's breathing was steadier now, fragile but present. Axel lay down beside the couch, positioning his body like a barrier between the child and the world. Mason sat in the armchair across from them, hands clasped, eyes fixed. Tomorrow would bring questions, names, authority. But tonight, in this small house overlooking a frozen harbor, Junie Vale was alive. And Mason Grady, who had spent years surviving without belonging, realized with a quiet certainty that the hardest battle was no longer behind him. It was beginning here, beside a fire, with a child who had finally said her name. Morning came slowly over Duluth, as if the city itself hesitated to disturb what the night had left behind. The storm had thinned to a fine, drifting snow, and pale light seeped through the living room curtains and cold ribbons. Outside, The harbor lay muted beneath ice and fog, cranes standing motionless like steel skeletons. Inside Mason Grady's house, the air held the steady warmth of the stove, but the tension in the room was sharper than any winter wind. Junie Vale slept on the couch beneath layered blankets, her cheeks no longer blue but still too pale. Her breathing was steadier, though each inhale carried a faint rasp that reminded Mason of Dr. Rhodes's warning. Pneumonia doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It creeps in. Axel lay beside the couch, body stretched along the rug like a living barricade. His ears flicked at every creak of the house, alert even in rest. Mason hadn't slept. He sat in the armchair across from them, hands clasped, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of Junie's chest. He had spent years living in controlled solitude, but there was nothing controlled about watching a child fight for warmth. Every sound felt amplified: the crackle of the fire, the soft exhale of the dog, the distant scrape of a plow somewhere down the street. Just after 8, Junie stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered open, and she blinked as if the warmth was unfamiliar. Her gaze landed on Axel first. The dog lifted his head slightly, meeting her eyes with calm focus. "You're still here," she whispered, voice thin. Mason leaned forward. "I'm here." Junie swallowed, her small fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "I thought people leave." The honesty in her tone struck deeper than any accusation. Mason didn't answer with reassurance he couldn't prove. He only said firmly, "Not today." He brought her a glass of warm water in careful sips, watching as she drank like someone who had learned not to ask for too much. Axel's nose hovered near her hand, close enough to comfort, far enough not to overwhelm. Mason had just set the cup down when the knock came. It wasn't the brisk, practical knock of Dr. Rhodes. This one was heavier, official, the kind that carried authority in each measured rap. Axel's head snapped up instantly. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a growl of aggression, but warning. Mason rose. His body moved before his mind finished processing, the reflex of a man who had answered too many doors in hostile places. Maehi placed a steadying hand on Axel's collar. "Stay," he murmured. Axel obeyed, muscles tense. Mason opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, framed by drifting snow. She was in her early 30s, tall and straight-backed, dressed in a dark county uniform with a badge pinned neatly at her chest. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail beneath a winter cap, not a strand out of place despite the wind. Her face was sharp-featured, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, lips set in a line that suggested she didn't waste words. Pale skin, flushed slightly from the cold, contrasted with eyes an unyielding blue. This was not a woman who relied on charm. She carried herself like someone who had learned discipline the hard way, as if softness had once cost her something. "Mr. Grady?" Her voice was calm, professional. Yes. I'm Officer Harper Sloan, County Child Services Liaison." She held up an ID card briefly, though the badge already made the point. "Dr. Rhodes filed a report last night. A minor found abandoned." Mason's shoulders tightened. She needed medical help. "I'm aware." Harper's gaze flicked past him into the house, precise as a scanner. She noted the stove, the blankets, Axel's watchful form near the couch. Her expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes sharpened with assessment rather than judgment. "I need to see the child," she said, "and I need to ask you some questions." Mason hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Harper entered, stomping snow from her boots. She moved with deliberate efficiency, like someone used to entering unfamiliar homes without apology. Her gaze landed on Junie, small under blankets. And for the first time her composure faltered, only a fraction, a brief tightening around the eyes. Junie watched her warily. "Are you taking me?" Harper knelt beside the couch, careful not to loom. Up close, Mason noticed faint, tired lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that came from long responsibility rather than age. "My job is to make sure you're safe," Harper said evenly. "Right now you are, but there are procedures." Junie's fingers clenched the blanket. Axel shifted closer, positioning himself between Harper and the child without being told. Harper glanced at the dog, then at Mason. "He's trained," Mason said quietly. "I can see that." Harper's voice held no fear, only acknowledgement. "Military? K-9 unit?" Harper nodded once, as if filing it away. She stood, turning her attention fully to Mason. "Mr. Grady, I need your statement. Where did you find her?" Mason described the bridge, the box, the note. Harper listened without interruption, her face unreadable. Only when he mentioned the words on the paper did something flicker. Anger, maybe, or fatigue. "And you brought her here instead of directly to the hospital," Harper said. "Rhodes said warming her too fast could kill her," Mason answered. "I called him immediately." Harper's gaze held his. "You did the right thing medically, but legally—" She paused, choosing her words. "You understand she is now a ward of the county until guardianship is determined." The phrase hit like ice water. Mason's jaw clenched. "She's not an object." "No." Harper's tone remained controlled, but firm. "She's a child," which is exactly why the county gets involved. Abandonment cases attract people who think they can do good without knowing the full danger. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Danger?" Harper's mouth tightened slightly. "Sometimes the people who leave children come back. Sometimes there's criminal history. Sometimes there's trafficking. Sometimes there are reasons you don't want." The realism in her words was colder than the weather outside. Mason absorbed it, anger shifting into something heavier. Understanding. Junie spoke weakly from the couch. "No one is coming back for me." Harper's eyes moved to her. "You don't know that," she said gently, then corrected herself, voice quieter. "You shouldn't have to know that." Silence settled. The stove cracked softly. Axel's breathing was steady, protective. Harper exhaled. "Here is what will happen. Junie will need to be seen at the county clinic today. After that, we arrange temporary placement." Mason's hand curled. "Temporary placement where?" "A foster home, likely." Harper's voice stayed professional, but Mason caught something underneath. Distaste, perhaps. "Or an emergency shelter." Junie's face drained of what little color she had gained. Her eyes widened. "Please don't." Mason stepped forward instinctively. "She stays here, at least until she's stable." Harper's gaze sharpened. "That is not your decision." Mason's voice dropped. "You saw her. She trusts Axel more than she trusts adults. You move her now, you break whatever fragile thread is keeping her steady." Harper hesitated. For a long moment her expression remained carved from duty. Then her eyes flicked downward, just briefly, as if she were seeing something else, something personal. Mason noticed for the first time a thin scar along the edge of her left eyebrow, faint but deliberate, a mark from an old injury, the kind that stays. Harper spoke again, quieter. "My father was a sheriff. He died on duty when I was 15. The admission was unexpected, almost out of place, but it explained her posture, her rigidity. Duty wasn't a job to her, it was inheritance. "I learned early what happens when rules are ignored," she continued. "But I also learned what happens when rules become excuses." She looked at Junie, small and trembling. Axel pressed his side against the couch like an anchor. "I can file a delayed transfer," Harper said finally. 24 hours. Rhodes's report supports medical necessity." Mason's breath caught. That gives her time." "It gives you time," Harper corrected, "not ownership." Mason nodded once. He understood the boundary she was drawing. Harper pulled a form from her folder, writing quickly. Her handwriting was sharp, controlled. She set the paper on the table beside Rhodes's instructions and the folded note. "I'll return this afternoon with transport to the clinic," she said. "Do not leave town." "I won't," Mason replied. At the door, Harper paused. Her eyes flicked once more toward Junie. The child's fingers were still clutching Axel's fur. Harper's voice lowered, almost inaudible. "You did a good thing. Just don't let it get you crushed." Then she stepped back into the snow, the badge disappearing into the whiteness. Mason closed the door slowly. The house felt smaller now, the warmth surrounded by invisible walls of law and procedure. Junie's eyes brimmed with fear. "She'll take me," she whispered. Mason crossed the room and crouched beside her. He didn't promise impossibilities. He only said what he knew to be true. "Not without a fight, and not while you're sick." Axel nudged Junie's hand gently, as if sealing the vow. The storm outside had eased, but Mason understood something clearly. Winter wasn't finished. It had only changed shape. By noon, the snow over Duluth had softened into a slow, cautious drift. The storm no longer screamed. It lingered, as if winter had decided to watch instead of strike. The streets were plowed into narrow corridors between walls of packed ice, and the harbor lay under a pale veil of fog. The city looked calm from a distance, but Mason Grady understood better. Calm was often just the pause before something official arrived. Junie sat bundled in the passenger seat of Mason's truck, wrapped in blankets so thick she appeared smaller than ever. The heater blasted warm air, filling the cab with dry heat, but her hands remained tucked under the fabric, fingers clenched as though warmth was something that could be taken away. Axel sat in the back, steady and alert, amber eyes tracking every movement beyond the windows. He wore his working harness, the black straps fitting snug against his lean frame, a quiet reminder that he was not simply a pet. Mason drove with both hands on the wheel, jaw set. The delayed transfer Harper Sloan had granted felt less like mercy and more like borrowed time. Every stoplight seemed too long. Every passing cruiser made his shoulders tighten. The county clinic sat on the edge of town, a squat brick building with frosted windows and an American flag snapping stiffly in the wind. It wasn't large, but it carried the weight of authority, forms, files, decisions made by people who rarely saw the lives behind them. Harper was waiting near the entrance when Mason pulled in. She stood straight in her uniform, blonde ponytail tucked neatly beneath her cap, her posture sharp enough to cut glass. Her expression was professional, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Junie, checking her color, her breathing, the way she clung to the blanket. "Bring her inside," Harper said. No greeting, no small talk. Mason climbed out and opened the passenger door carefully. Junie hesitated, eyes wide, scanning the building as if it might swallow her whole. Axel jumped down smoothly, positioning himself close. He did not press forward, only stayed near Junie's side like an anchor. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and overheated air. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The waiting room was sparsely populated, an older man coughing into his sleeve, a young mother rocking a toddler. Junie's gaze dropped instantly, making herself smaller. A nurse approached. She was middle-aged, with dark hair streaked gray and soft lines around her eyes that suggested kindness worn thin by years of work. Her name tag read Marisol Bennett. She gave Junie a gentle smile. "Well, hello there, sweetheart," Marisol said warmly. "Let's get you checked out." Junie didn't answer, but Axel's ears perked as if noting the nurse's tone. Mason followed them down a hallway, Harper walking behind with her folder tucked under her arm like a shield. The exam room was small. Marisol guided Junie onto the table with practiced care, checking her temperature, listening to her lungs. Junie coughed twice, a dry sound that made Mason's stomach tighten. "Still some crackling," Marisol murmured. "She needs antibiotics today." Mason nodded. Harper watched quietly, her expression unreadable, but her fingers tightened once around the folder's edge. Marisol glanced at Axel. "That dog is very well trained." "He's military K9, Mason said. "I can tell," she replied. "He looks at her like she's his assignment." Axel shifted slightly closer to Junie, as if confirming it. When Marisol left to prepare medication, Harper stepped forward, her voice lowered. "After this, I'll need to log her into the county system," she said. "It's procedure." Mason's gaze sharpened. "And after that?" Harper's jaw tightened. "Placement options will be discussed." Junie's face drained again. She whispered, barely audible, "Please." Mason's hands curled into fists. He forced them open. Before Harper could respond, the door opened. A man entered with the kind of confidence that didn't belong in a small-town clinic. He was in his mid-40s, tall, sharply built, wearing a charcoal overcoat that looked expensive enough to never have touched snow until today. His hair was dark blonde, slicked back neatly, and his face was clean-shaven except for a perfectly trimmed edge along his jawline, as if even stubble would be disorder. His eyes were pale blue, cold, evaluating. He carried himself like someone used to rooms bending around him. Harper stiffened immediately. "Mr. Huxley?" The man offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Officer Sloan, I didn't expect to see you handling this personally." Mason felt Axel's posture change, the dog's body going subtly tense. Not aggression, but awareness. Harper's tone sharpened. "This is an active county case. Why are you here?" The man's gaze slid to Mason, then to Junie. It lingered on the blankets, the fragility. Yes, it's Grant Huxley, he introduced smoothly. County Placement Review Agent. Mason didn't offer his hand. Grant didn't seem to mind. He glanced briefly at Axel again, annoyance flickering so fast it was almost invisible. A former Navy SEAL, Grant said, voice conversational, as though reading from an internal file. Living alone, combat record, no prior guardianship experience. Mason's stomach tightened. You did your homework quickly. Grant's smile thinned. That's my job. Children require appropriate placement. Sentiment cannot override policy. Junie shrank back. Axel stepped closer, his shoulder nearly touching the exam table. Grant continued, voice calm. Mr. Grady, you must understand the county's concern. Trauma history, isolation. This is not an environment verified for a child. Harper's eyes narrowed slightly. This is a medical appointment, not a hearing. Grant's gaze flicked to her. Everything becomes a hearing when liability is involved. Mason's voice dropped. She was abandoned under a bridge. That's the liability. Grant's eyes stayed cold, which is precisely why the state assumes custody. Junie's breathing quickened. Her fingers gripped Axel's fur. Don't take me, she whispered, voice cracking. Grant crouched slightly, coat creasing reluctantly. Junie, the state will ensure you have stability. His tone was practiced kindness, the kind used in brochures. Axel let out a low sound, barely audible. Mason placed a steady hand on the dog's harness, not restraining him, simply grounding himself. Grant straightened. I will file my preliminary evaluation today. Officer Sloan, I'll require full documentation within 24 hours. Harper's mouth tightened. This is moving fast. It should, Grant replied. Cases like this attract complications. His eyes flicked toward Mason in a way that felt like a warning, disguised as professionalism. Then he turned and left the room without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Silence settled heavily. Marisol returned moments later with medication, sensing tension, but not asking. She handed Mason the antibiotics and instructions. Outside the clinic, Mason carried Junie back to the truck. Her face was tight with fear, the brief warmth of safety already threatened by paperwork and suits. Axel jumped into the back seat, eyes still sharp, watching the building until it disappeared behind them. Harper stood beside Mason's door, and snow dusted her shoulders. She looked tired for the first time. Grant Huxley doesn't usually come in person, she said quietly. Mason glanced at her. Why did he? Harper hesitated. Because this case will become political. Someone wants it clean. Quiet. Mason's jaw clenched. And fast. Harper nodded once. Be careful, Mr. Grady. People like him don't lose battles. They change the rules. Mason looked down at Junie through the window. She was staring at her hands, as if trying to disappear. He spoke softly, more vow than statement. Then, I'll need to learn a different kind of fight. Axel's reflection in the glass looked back like a silent oath. Winter hadn't ended. It had simply put on a suit. The drive back from the clinic felt longer than the miles deserved. Duluth streets were lined with compacted snow and gray slush, and the winter sky hung low, pressing the city into a muted, narrowed world. Mason Grady kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, but his mind ran elsewhere, on Grant Huxley's polished voice, on the way liability had sounded like a weapon, on Junie's face tightening with fear as soon as the word state was spoken. Junie sat, curled beneath her blankets, small and silent. The antibiotic bottle rested in Mason's cup holder like a fragile promise. Axel watched everything from the back seat, ears flicking toward each passing car, each pedestrian bundled against the cold. He was calm, but there was a sharpened vigilance in the way his body held itself. As if he understood this threat wore paperwork instead of teeth. When Mason pulled into his driveway, Junie hesitated before moving. Home was still a strange concept, something uncertain. Mason opened her door carefully. You're safe here, he said, not as comfort, but as fact. Junie's eyes lifted briefly. For how long? The question landed heavy. Mason didn't answer with something false. He simply said, long enough. Inside, the house smelled of stove heat and the faint medicinal sharpness of disinfectant from the clinic instructions tucked in his pocket. Axel paced once, then settled near the couch as Junie climbed back onto her blankets. Her cough was quieter now, but it remained, a reminder that she wasn't out of danger. Mason poured water, set out the first dose of antibiotics with careful precision, then stood by the window, Ned watching the street. He hadn't realized how quickly his life had shifted from solitude to siege. The knock came in the late afternoon. This one was not official. It was lighter, almost hesitant, the kind of knock that asked permission rather than demanded entry. Axel's head lifted, but he didn't tense the same way. Mason moved to the door, cautious anyway, and opened it. A woman stood on the porch with snow clinging to the shoulders of her wool coat. She was in her late 50s, petite, with soft silver hair tucked into a loose braid that escaped from beneath her hat. Round glasses sat low on her nose, and her cheeks were flushed from cold. She held a basket covered with a folded towel, and the smell of something warm drifted up immediately. Bread, maybe soup. "Mr. Grady?" she asked, voice gentle but direct. Mason blinked. Yes, I'm Mabel Rowe." She offered a small smile. "I run the bakery on 5th. Rowe's Oven." Mason knew the place by sight. Warm lights, the scent of cinnamon spilling into winter air. He'd never gone in. Mabel's eyes moved past him, catching sight of Junie on the couch. Something softened in her expression. "Word travels fast in a town like this," she said quietly. "A little girl found under a bridge, a veteran bringing her home." Mason's jaw tightened. "People shouldn't gossip about her." "It isn't gossip," Mabel replied, calm but firm. "It's concern, and kindness, if you let it be." She lifted the basket slightly. "Chicken soup, fresh bread. You look like a man who forgot to eat." Mason hesitated, unused to unsolicited care. Then he stepped back. "Thank you." Mabel entered, boots leaving damp marks on the mat. She moved toward Junie slowly, not crowding. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. Junie's eyes widened, wary. Mabel crouched to her level, her movements careful, practiced in gentleness. "I'm Mabel. I make bread. Bread fixes more things than people realize." Junie didn't smile, but her shoulders eased a fraction. Axel approached, sniffed Mabel's gloved hand, then accepted her presence with quiet approval. Mabel chuckled under her breath. "Well, if he says I'm all right, that's good enough." Mason watched the exchange with a strange tightness in his chest. He hadn't expected anyone to show up with warmth. He had expected scrutiny. Mabel set the basket on the counter. "You're going to need more than soup," she said, standing again. "You're going to need voices." Mason frowned. "Voices?" Mabel's gaze sharpened. "Our county agents like Grant Huxley don't come down here unless something matters. And when something matters to them, it's rarely the child." The bluntness surprised him. Before Mason could respond, headlights swept briefly across the front window. Axel's ears snapped upright. His body went still. Mason turned toward the glass. A vehicle slowed near the curb, idling for a beat too long, then continued down the street. Junie's fingers tightened around her blanket. Mabel noticed, her face tightening. "That happens often?" Mason's voice was low. "No." Axel moved to the window, posture rigid, eyes fixed outward. Mason's instincts flared. "Stay with her," he murmured to Axel, though the dog had already placed himself between Junie and the room. The house felt different now, less private, less invisible. Another knock came shortly after, heavier, familiar. Mason opened the door to Sheriff Nolan Briggs. Briggs was in his late 40s, tall with a rugged build shaped by years of patrol work and practical labor. His dark hair was threaded with gray, and a thick stubble covered his jaw as if shaving was optional in winter. His face carried weather lines around the eyes, the kind earned from squinting into storms and dealing with people's worst days. He removed his hat as he stepped in, respectful. "Mason," he said, voice steady. "Heard you've had a rough 24 hours. Mason's posture remained guarded. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Briggs's gaze flicked to Junie. His expression softened, just slightly. "Not what you think?" Mabel straightened beside the counter. "Sheriff Briggs." He nodded to her. Mabel. Junie watched him like she watched everyone, prepared for disappointment. Briggs exhaled and lowered his voice. "Grant Huxley's involved now." Mason's eyes narrowed. "I noticed." Briggs leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. "Huxley doesn't specialize in children. He specializes in clean outcomes, fast ones. And he has friends in development circles." Mason's jaw tightened. "Development?" Briggs's eyes held grim clarity. There's a company out of Minneapolis sniffing around the harbor. Resort expansion, private lodging. They want property near the canal. Mason felt something cold settle in his stomach. Briggs continued carefully. Your rental isn't the prize, but the land you used to own outside town, the one you refused to sell when you got back, they haven't forgotten it. Mason's fists curled. He hadn't thought about that acreage in years, the quiet patch of land he'd kept, because it was the last thing that felt untouched. Briggs's voice lowered. If they paint you unstable, unfit, involved in a custody dispute, pressure builds. People make offers. People lean. Junie whispered, barely audible. It's because of me. Mason turned to her immediately. No, it's because of them. Axel nudged Junie's knee, grounding her. Mabel's lips pressed into a thin line. So she's leverage. Briggs nodded grimly. It's possible. Silence thickened in the room, broken only by the stove crackling. Mason stared at the folded note on the table, then at the antibiotic bottle, then at Junie's exhausted face. War came in many forms. He recognized this one now. Paperwork, politics, manipulation. Briggs straightened. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you to prepare. Tomorrow they'll push harder. Mason's voice was steady, dangerous in its restraint. Then tomorrow I'll stand. Briggs's gaze held respect. Standing alone gets men buried. Find allies. Mabel placed a hand lightly on Mason's arm, brief but certain. You have them. Junie's eyes shimmered, fragile hope flickering. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft as ash. The town looked peaceful, but Mason understood the truth. Someone had already started watching. That night, after Mabel left and Briggs returned to his patrol, Mason tucked Junie into the small spare bed he hadn't used since moving in. Axel lay down beside the door, guarding. Mason stepped onto the porch alone. Cold air cut into him. He scanned the fence line. Far down the street, a pair of headlights glimmered briefly, then vanished. Mason's jaw tightened. Winter had brought Junie to him. Now, Winter would test what he was willing to fight for. The night passed in fragments. Mason Grady dozed in the armchair with his boots still on, waking at every small sound, the groan of the house settling, the hiss of wind against the siding, Axel's subtle shift near the bedroom door. The dog never truly slept. He lay stretched along the threshold like a sentry, eyes half-lidded but present, ears catching what humans missed. Inside the spare room, Junie's breathing rose and fell with the shallow rhythm of recovery, punctuated now and then by a soft cough that tightened Mason's chest each time he heard it. Just before dawn, Duluth was colorless. The harbor outside was a flat sheet of ice and fog, the city muffled beneath new snow. Mason stood at the kitchen sink, staring at nothing, coffee cooling untouched beside him. He had fought wars where danger wore uniforms and carried weapons. This was different. This threat arrived with folders, with signatures, with polite voices that could remove a child as easily as erasing a name. Axel padded in quietly, brushing Mason's leg once, a grounding gesture. Mason rested a hand on the dog's head, fingers threading through short fur. At 7, Junie appeared in the hallway, wrapped in a blanket that dragged behind her like a cloak. Her face still held pallor, but her eyes were clearer today, gray and watchful, like a lake beginning to thaw. She stopped when she saw Mason. "Are they coming?" she asked. Mason didn't lie. "Yes." Junie's small fingers tightened around the blanket edge. "Will you let them take me?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was practical, born from experience. Mason crouched to her height, meeting her gaze. I won't hand you over to strangers who don't know you," he said. "But we may have to prove you're safe here. That's what today is." Junie swallowed. Axel moved to her side, pressing his shoulder lightly against her shin. She leaned into him without thinking, trusting the dog more easily than the world. By mid-morning, the knock came again, firm, official. Officer Harper Sloan stood on the porch, uniform crisp, blonde hair pulled tight beneath her cap. Snow clung to her shoulders. Her expression was controlled, but Mason noticed the faint tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the street before focusing on him. "Mr. Grady," she said, "we need to go." "Where?" Mason asked. Harper's voice lowered. "There's an emergency review hearing. Grant Huxley pushed for it. He wants a judge's order fast." Junie froze behind Mason. Axel's ears lifted sharply. Mason's gaze narrowed. Today? Harper nodded once. This is how they move. Momentum. If you're unprepared, you lose by default. Mason stepped aside to let her in. Harper glanced toward Junie, her expression shifting for a fraction, softer. You'll be present, Harper said gently. But you don't have to speak unless asked. Junie nodded stiffly. Harper's eyes moved to Axel. The dog stays? He doesn't leave her, Mason replied. Harper hesitated, then said quietly, Fine, but keep him close. The courthouse in Duluth was small compared to city courts, a brick building with chipped steps and pillars stained by decades of winter storms. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and disinfectant. Voices echoed down hallways lined with framed portraits of judges long retired. Mason carried Junie's hand in his, feeling how light her fingers were, how quickly they trembled. Axel walked at Mason's heel, calm but intensely aware, nails clicking softly on the tile. In the waiting area, outside the courtroom, Grant Huxley stood with two men in suits. He looked untouched by cold, charcoal coat immaculate, gloves dark leather. His hair was still slicked back perfectly, and his pale blue eyes held that same polished emptiness. Beside him was a thin man with sharp features and a tablet in hand, likely an assistant, and an older attorney with a heavy jaw and a clipped gray beard, the kind of man who had made a career out of turning human lives into arguments. Grant's gaze slid to Junie, then to Axel, annoyance flashing briefly. "Oh, Grady," he said pleasantly. "I'm glad you came willingly." Mason's voice was flat. "I didn't come for you." Grant smiled thinly. "Of course. You came because you understand the law." Harper's posture stiffened beside Mason. "This is an emergency review, not a custody transfer." Grant's eyes turned toward her. "Not yet." The courtroom was modest. A few benches, a raised desk for the judge, flags in the corners. Junie sat beside Mason, shoulders hunched, blanket wrapped around her like armor. Axel lay at her feet, head up, unwavering. Judge Everett Lang entered quietly. He was in his late 60s, lean, with deep lines etched into his face from years of measured decisions. His white hair was combed neatly, and his eyes were sharp but not cruel, eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize it without spectacle. Grant stood first, his voice smooth. "Your Honor, this child was found abandoned. Mr. Grady is a single veteran with documented combat trauma. The county must assume custody immediately for proper placement." Mason felt Junie flinch beside him. Axel's body tightened subtly. Harper rose. "Your Honor, the child is medically fragile. Removal now could worsen her condition. Mr. Grady acted appropriately, called a physician, ensured warmth and safety." Grant's attorney added, voice gravelly, "Safety is not proven by intention. It is proven by compliance." Judge Lang's gaze moved to Mason. "Mr. Grady, do you wish to speak?" Mason stood slowly, his shoulders squared, not in aggression, but in the disciplined calm of someone who refused to be diminished. "I found her under a bridge in a cardboard box," Mason said evenly. "She was freezing. She would have died. I brought her home because there was no time to wait for systems to arrive," Grant interjected softly. "Heroism does not equal guardianship." Mason's eyes hardened. "This isn't about heroism. It's about responsibility." Judge Lang's gaze flicked to Junie. "Junie Vale, do you understand what's being discussed?" Junie's voice was barely audible. "They want to take me." Grant leaned forward. "We want to place you somewhere stable." Junie's gray eyes lifted, sharper now. "Stable means strangers." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Judge Lang raised a hand for silence. Harper spoke again, voice quieter but firm. "Your Honor, I request temporary medical guardianship. Remain with Mr. Grady for 72 hours while we complete a full review. Immediate transfer is unnecessary and potentially harmful." Grant's smile didn't change, but something colder entered his eyes. "Delay only complicates." Judge Lang studied Mason, then Junie, then Axel at her feet like an oath carved into flesh. Finally he spoke. "This court will not order immediate removal today. The child will remain with Mr. Grady under county supervision until a full hearing next week." Junie gasped softly. Mason exhaled, attention releasing by inches. Grant's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Judge Lang continued. "Officer Sloan, ensure compliance. Mr. Grady, you will cooperate fully. Any violation and custody transfers immediately. Mason nodded once. Understood. The gavel struck, soft but final. Outside, Grant approached Mason in the hallway, voice polite. You've bought time, he said. Time doesn't change outcomes. Mason's eyes held steady. Ah, it changes lives. Grant's smile sharpened like a blade. We'll see. Harper stepped between them subtly, escorting Mason and Junie away. Back outside, snow began falling again, heavier now, thickening the air. Duluth looked blurred, uncertain, as if the city itself sensed pressure gathering. Junie clutched Mason's sleeve. I can stay? For now, Mason said. Axel pressed close, steady as stone. Mason understood the truth. This wasn't victory. It was the first warning rumble before the real storm. The snow thickened by evening, slow and heavy, muting Duluth beneath a white hush that made the city feel suspended between breaths. Streetlights blurred into pale orbs behind the falling flakes, and the harbor disappeared into fog like a memory refusing clarity. Mason Grady drove home from the courthouse with one hand steady on the wheel and the other resting lightly near Junie, as though proximity alone could keep her from being taken. Junie sat bundled in the passenger seat, quieter than before. Relief had touched her briefly when the judge ruled she could stay, but fear returned quickly, settling into her bones the way cold did. Temporary meant fragile. Temporary meant waiting for the next knock. Axel watched from the back seat, ears pivoting at every sound outside the truck, eyes reflecting streetlight in sharp amber glints. But he seemed to understand that the danger was not over. It had simply learned patience. Back at the house, warmth greeted them, but it did not erase the tension. The stove crackled steadily, casting soft orange light across the living room. Junie curled on the couch with a book Mabel Rowe had dropped off earlier, an old children's atlas with worn edges. She traced the map with her fingertip, as if searching for a place that felt safe. Mason stood at the kitchen counter, reading the court order Harper had handed him. County supervision, full cooperation, a hearing next week. The words were neat, official, and mercilessly impersonal. Axel lay near Junie, head up, alert but calm. The dog's presence had become a constant, an anchor against the shifting uncertainty of everything else. A knock came after dark. Mason froze. Axel's head lifted instantly, posture sharpening. Junie's hand tightened on the atlas. It's okay, Mason murmured, though he wasn't sure it was. He moved to the door. Harper Sloane stood outside, snow dusting her cap and shoulders. Her face looked more tired than it had earlier, the rigid discipline worn down by something unsettled beneath. Mason, she said quietly, may I come in? He stepped aside. Harper entered, stamping snow from her boots. Her eyes flicked toward Junie, then Axel, then back to Mason. I shouldn't be here off hours, she admitted, but I need you to understand something before the next hearing. Mason's jaw tightened. What? Harper took a breath, then pulled a thick folder from her coat. The edges were creased, as though it had been opened and closed too many times already. This is Junie's preliminary file, she said. Mason stared at it. Why do you have that? Harper's gaze lowered. Because Grant Huxley requested accelerated background checks. He wants leverage. Axel's ears angled forward. Junie looked up from the couch, eyes wary. Harper spoke again, voice controlled but quiet. Most abandoned children have gaps, missing information, but Junie's case is being treated differently, too quickly, too aggressively. Mason's throat tightened. What does the file say? Harper hesitated. Then she opened it. Inside were photocopies, intake forms, and one photograph that made Mason's breath stop. It was Junie, not 7 years old and shaking in a box, but younger, maybe 5, standing stiffly in front of a stained wall, hair brushed too tight, eyes already guarded. A number card hung from her neck like a mugshot. Junie saw it too, her face drained. Mason's voice went low. Where was that taken? Harper swallowed. A private foster facility outside Minneapolis. One with complaints. Junie's fingers curled into the blanket. I was there, she whispered. The words were brittle. Harper's voice softened. Junie, you don't have to. Yes, Junie said suddenly, sharper than her small body suggested. Her gray eyes lifted, full of something old. I was there. They said it was a home. It wasn't. Silence thickened. The stove crackled. Axel pressed closer to Junie's leg. Mason crouched slightly. What happened? Junie's breathing quickened. Her voice came haltingly, like stepping across ice. They moved us. A lot. If someone cried, they got put in a room alone. If someone asked for their mom, and they said moms didn't come back. Harper's jaw tightened, anger flickering beneath professionalism. Junie continued, quieter. One night, a man came. He wore a suit, like Grant. Mason's stomach dropped. Junie's eyes stared at nothing. They told me to smile, to be grateful. I didn't want to go with him. Axel let out a low sound, not a growl, but something darker. Mason placed a steady hand on the dog's harness, grounding both of them. Harper's voice turned ice cold. Did you go? Junie shook her head. I ran, I hid. After that, they sent me away. I kept getting sent away. Mason felt heat rise, sharp and sickening. This wasn't abandonment by one person. This was abandonment by a system. Harper closed her eyes briefly, as if seeing too much. Grant Huxley has connections with placement contractors, she said quietly. Yep, facilities, agencies, people who profit from moving children like paperwork. Mason's fists clenched. And he wants Junie back in that system. Harper nodded once. Or he wants you unstable enough to lose. Mason straightened slowly. His voice was controlled, but something dangerous lived beneath it. Why are you telling me this? Harper's face tightened. Because I've followed protocol my whole career. I believed rules were protection. She swallowed. My father died because someone broke procedure. I built my life around never letting emotions blur judgment. Her eyes flicked toward Junie, small and trembling. But some procedures are cages, Harper said quietly. And I can't pretend I don't see it anymore, Junie whispered, almost inaudible. Will they send me back? Mason crossed the room and knelt beside her, careful not to overwhelm. Not if I can stop it. Junie's eyes shimmered. People always say that. Mason's voice softened, steady. I'm not people. Axel nudged Junie's hand gently, sealing the moment. Harper slid one document from the folder. This is what Grant will use next week, she said. He'll argue you're unfit. He'll argue Junie needs structured placement. Mason looked at the paper. Phrases like combat trauma risks, single household instability, emergency custody transfer. He understood the battlefield now. It was ink, not bullets, Harper continued. You need testimony, community statements, proof you're stable, that she's safe. Mason nodded slowly. Mabel, Sheriff Briggs, Dr. Rhodes. Harper's gaze held his. And Junie needs her story, not just fear, truth. Junie flinched. Harper softened. Only what you can share. How no one will force you. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Snow fell heavier, relentless. Harper closed the folder and stood. I shouldn't have shown you this, she admitted. But I couldn't let you walk blind into next week. Mason's voice was quiet. Thank you. Harper's mouth tightened, almost regretful. Don't thank me yet. Grant doesn't lose. He just changes tactics. At the door, she paused. Lock your windows. If you see that car again, call Briggs. Then she was gone, swallowed by winter darkness. Mason stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the snow-filled street. The storm had returned, thick and blinding. Behind him, Junie's breathing trembled. Axel lay beside her like a vow. Mason understood now. Next week wasn't just a hearing. It was a verdict on whether the system would erase Junie again. And he would not let it. The days leading up to the full hearing moved with a strange double weight. Time felt slow in the house, measured in Junie's coughs growing lighter, in the careful doses of antibiotics, in the way Axel never drifted far from her side. Yet outside, the county's machinery moved quickly, unseen but constant. Forms filed, evaluations scheduled, decisions leaning toward conclusion before anyone spoke them aloud. Duluth remained wrapped in winter, but the cold had begun to change. Snowbanks still rose along the streets like hardened walls, yet occasional drops of meltwater slipped from rooftops at midday, tapping softly against ice. It was the smallest sign that even the harshest season could loosen its grip. Mason Grady spent those days doing something he had never trained for. He gathered evidence. He asked for help. It felt unnatural, almost humiliating at first. In the teams, you carried your own weight. You didn't ask strangers to hold it. But this wasn't a mission that could be completed alone. This was a child, and the enemy was not a man in the dark, but an institution wearing clean gloves. On the second morning after Harper's visit, Dr. Calvin Rhodes returned for a follow-up. The older physician's movements were as efficient as ever, his silver hair still cropped close, his wire-framed glasses catching light from the window. He listened to Junie's lungs, brows pinching. "Better," he said. "Not perfect, but better. She'll recover if she stays warm and steady." Junie sat very still, hands folded in her lap. Her gray eyes tracked the doctor carefully, wary, but less frightened than before. Rhodes straightened and looked at Mason. "I'll testify," he said simply. Mason blinked. "You don't have to." Rhodes' mouth tightened. "I watched you keep her alive through the night. That's enough." Later that afternoon, Mabel Rowe arrived again, cheeks pink from cold, braid tucked into her scarf. She brought more than soup this time. She brought paper. "These are statements," she explained, placing a folder on the table. "People from town, folks who may not know you well, but they know what's right." Mason opened it slowly. Names filled the pages: teachers, shop owners, dock workers, words written in uneven handwriting, but steady conviction. "She needs a home. He saved her. We've seen him with that child. She is safe." Mason's throat tightened unexpectedly. Mabel's gaze was firm. "Grant Huxley thinks small towns don't have spines," she said. He's wrong." Sheriff Nolan Briggs came by that evening, heavy boots stamping snow from the porch. His rugged face looked more worn than before, stubble dark against weathered skin. "Briggs," Mason greeted. The sheriff held out a manila envelope. "Background," he said. "Grant's connections, not illegal on paper, but suspicious enough to make a judge pause." Mason frowned. "How did you get this?" Briggs's expression tightened. "I've been sheriff here a long time. I know which doors open when you knock hard enough." Axel lifted his head at Briggs's voice, then settled again, trusting the man's presence. Junie watched from the couch, still cautious but curious now, as if trying to understand why people were showing up for her. That night, Mason found Junie standing by the living room window. Snow fell quietly beyond the glass. She held the worn atlas in her hands. "Junie," he said softly. She didn't turn at first. "Why are they helping?" she asked. Mason stepped closer. "Because they should have helped sooner." Junie's voice was small. "People didn't help at the last place." "I know," Mason said. "This is different." She finally looked at him. "Is it?" Mason didn't answer. With certainty he couldn't promise. He answered with truth. "I'm trying to make it different." The morning of the hearing arrived with brittle sunlight. The courthouse steps were still rimmed with ice, but the air held less bite than before. Mason dressed carefully, not in military uniform, but in clean, simple clothes, a dark coat, pressed jeans, boots without mud. He wanted no excuse given for instability. Junie wore a borrowed sweater Mabel had brought, soft and pale blue, the color making her look less like a ghost. Axel wore his harness, posture calm but alert. Officer Harper Sloan met them outside. Her face was composed, but Mason saw tension in her eyes. She had crossed lines for this. "You ready?" she asked quietly. Mason nodded. "As much as I can be." Inside the courtroom, Grant Huxley waited again, immaculate as ever. His pale eyes flicked over Junie, over Axel, over Mason, as if calculating. Judge Everett Lang entered, expression unreadable. Proceedings began with Grant's practiced certainty. He spoke of placement, structure, liability. He spoke as if Junie were a file, not a child. Then Harper spoke, presenting her delayed transfer documentation, her voice steady. Then Dr. Rhodes testified, blunt and clinical. "Removing her that first night would have killed her," he said. Grady's actions were correct. His care since has been consistent." Grant's attorney attempted to undermine Mason with words like trauma, combat history, isolation. And then, one by one, the town rose. Mabel Rowe stepped forward, small but unwavering. "I've baked bread in this town for 30 years, she said. "I know what hunger looks like. That child is no longer hungry in his home." Sheriff Briggs spoke next, voice rough. "This is a good man. The county should be ashamed it didn't find her first." Even Marisol Bennett, the nurse, appeared briefly, offering professional testimony. Junie's improvement, the calm environment, the bond. Grant's smile thinned with each witness. Finally, Judge Lang looked at Junie. "Do you want to say anything?" The room went still. Junie's hands trembled. Axel shifted closer, grounding her. Junie's voice was quiet but clear. "I don't want to be moved again," she said. "Every place says it's temporary. Temporary feels like disappearing." She swallowed hard. Mason didn't look away. Mason's chest tightened. Judge Lang held silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. "This court is not blind to procedure," he said steadily. "But procedure is meant to serve children, not consume them." Grant stiffened. Judge Lang continued. "Given medical testimony, community support, and the child's expressed bond, I grant permanent guardianship to Mr. Mason Grady." Junie froze. The words hung in the air like warmth. "Effective immediately," the judge added. "Junie Vale will remain in his care. The county's petition for removal is denied." Junie's breath broke into a sound between laughter and sobbing. She turned to Mason, then eyes wide. "I can stay?" she whispered. Mason knelt, voice thick. "Yes, you're staying." She threw her arms around his neck with sudden force. Axel barked once, sharp and joyful, tail thumping against the floor. Across the room, Harper's rigid composure finally cracked. Tears shimmered in her eyes, quickly blinked away. Grant Huxley's face remained controlled, but his eyes were cold. He gathered his papers like a man already planning another battlefield. Outside, snow began to fall again, but softer now, almost gentle. Meltwater dripped steadily from the courthouse eaves. Winter was still present, but it no longer felt endless. That evening, back at the house, Junie sat at the table with a bowl of soup, actually eating without hesitation. Axel lay nearby, finally relaxed. Mason watched them, in the quiet weight of the past loosening. Junie looked up suddenly. "Mason?" "Yeah." She hesitated, then said softly, "Thank you for looking." Mason's throat tightened. He nodded once. Outside, Duluth's harbor lights glowed through thinning snow, and for the first time in years, Mason Grady felt something close to peace. In the end, this story reminds us of something powerful. Miracles don't always arrive with thunder or flashing lights. Sometimes they come quietly, through a stranger who stops in the cold, through the loyal heartbeat of a dog, through a broken child finding warmth for the first time. Maybe that is how God works most often, not by changing the storm, but by sending the right soul into it. Every act of kindness is a whisper from heaven, telling us that no one is truly forgotten in God's eyes. And in our everyday lives, we may never know when someone beside us is praying for a miracle, waiting for a hand, a voice, a second chance. So, if this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder to look up, to love deeper, and to help someone who feels invisible. Please share this video with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep spreading stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, and fill your life with warmth even in the coldest seasons. Amen.